What's going on, everybody? Happy day 7 of the 2021 Legislative Awareness Week. For those of you who don't know who I am, although if you have been following with us throughout the course of the week and on many other of the departmental modes of correspondence, chances are you already know who I am. My name is Matthew Schwartzman. I'm the Policy Advisor, Legislative Affairs for your Air Force Sergeants Association. But perhaps more importantly, I have been your moderator for the first ever virtual policy panels throughout the course of this amazing Legislative Awareness Week. The other panels, we covered how to be an advocacy all-star. We talked about the importance of the military tuition assistance program. And we also covered the ways in which we can expand TRICARE coverage for cranial remolding helmets. But for today's panel, we are going to be talking about an issue that has gotten a lot of coverage recently and has a very big impact on readiness, quality of life, and everything in between. And that specifically is sexual assault and harassment prevention and awareness. I'm joined with so many amazing panelists here tonight as we're going to be specifically covering ways in which we could better foster a zero tolerance climate and how we could provide better support to survivors who unfortunately have gone through some pretty traumatic experiences following pursuant to these horrible, horrific actions. And so it's not about me today, it's about the panelists, their contributions, and about each and every one of you, the viewers that may be impacted by this, or maybe you know someone who's been impacted by this. So with that, I want to take no more of your time. Let's go around the horn, and to our panelists, feel free to just introduce yourselves so the viewers at home can get to know you just a little bit better.
Hi, I'm Chief Master Sergeant Jessica McWayne. I'm currently up in Alaska as the 673rd Security Forces Squadron Senior Enlisted Leader. I'm going on 22 years active duty Air Force. So all of that time, regular Air Force, but Security Forces, teaching Airman Leadership School, spent 3 years as a first sergeant with a diamond, and then came back into my beret several years ago. I've been married for 9 years now, married into my daughter who's grown now, and actually my grandson turns 9 tomorrow. So I have a pretty unique makeup of a family, pretty diverse backgrounds in my career, not just sticking within one functional area. So a lot of experience, unfortunately, with the subject and what we're going to spend time talking about today, not just as a security forces member, as a police officer, law enforcement officer, but as a leader. And I would love to say that that this is something that we're only recently dealing with, but I have some striking examples from throughout my career, throughout my ranks, that I've either experienced or had friends, subordinates, colleagues, or even leaders deal with. So I appreciate the time, and I'm glad. Thank you, Matt, for this opportunity, and thank you for this being one of the subjects that we're specifically going to talk about during law this week.
Absolutely.
I can introduce myself.
Okay.
Did you want to go, Lauren?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. So my name is Sherry Barrett. I am, excuse me, I am a licensed clinical social worker here in Alaska. Have the privilege of working with these two ladies. So I am an embedded mental health provider here in the 673rd Security Forces Squadron. My background, I started off working with juveniles who were in the juvenile justice system. So started off with that, and then went into crisis and outpatient, and then here. So I've always had a very strong interest in kind of the forensic background or part of mental health and trauma, and all of those unique aspects of those populations that are a lot more susceptible to experiencing vast amount of trauma. So I am excited to be part of this and really appreciate the opportunity to kind of speak some of my opinions on all of this as well. So yeah, glad to be here.
Hey, thank you very much, Sherry.
I'm Staff Sergeant Clifton. I'm a 673rd Military Working Dog Handler, narcotics handler. Been in just about 8 years now. Been here at this base just touching 2. Sexual assault survivor and actual cervical cancer survivor as well.
Wow.
So
Hey, well, thank you guys for taking the time to be here and for doing this in a very public manner. First, I want to talk about what you guys feel is the current state of affairs with respect to the prevalence of sexual assault and harassment in the military. I know that on August 3rd, there was of this year, there was a New York Times article that was actually released that describes sexual assault in the military as a poison in the system. And I want to start with you, Jess. Is this an assessment that you would agree with? And if yes, can you quantify the impact that the high prevalence of sexual assault in the military has on readiness, quality of life, and everything in between?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would certainly agree. It's a poison in the system. I mean, if you look at just the context of calling something a poison, right? And what does that connotate to us? And it eats away at whatever it is, right? And it can degrade, it can consume, it can ruin whatever it is. So the health of our force, whether it's seen or unseen, whether a poison is diagnosed or undiagnosed, it still requires attention, or it will continue to spread throughout whatever that body is. And we're talking, that body being our military service experience, right, for men and women. And so when you talk, impact on readiness, I don't know that the idea of quantifying it really makes sense. And I say that because we quantify things like risk, right? We have charts and graphs, and we have the ability to paint a picture and quantify risk so that we know at what point does that risk become too much to tolerate, right? That we tip the scale and this is too much risk, even though we've done things to mitigate, we're still not comfortable. So we're not going to take the action. We're not going to go in that direction. But this is not, so sexual assault and harassment and that continuum of harm that exists is not something you can quantify. One instance alone ripples into so many aspects of just individual and team readiness alike. It breaks down trust. It detracts from focus on the mission. It detracts from physical and mental health, not just of the victim that was traumatized, but it ripples out across the force beyond what I think we're even necessarily looking at, even with the comprehensive review that the committee has done. It goes far beyond even what we recognize and acknowledge and talk about out loud. So I don't necessarily think that I can quantify it, but I can tell you that the impact on readiness goes far and goes deep and goes further than the immediate parties involved and the reactions that come from that.
Can you possibly speak just a little bit more about what you mean when you say that it goes further? How far does it go?
Well, I would offer that in any instance of anything that fits on that continuum of harm, sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape, for that individual, that's something that for that victim, they're going to carry that with them for the rest of their lives. So of course that means throughout the rest of their service, but there's trust that's broken. And depending on how we react and how we respond and how we service and support and protect the rights of that victim and help that victim work through the trauma and keep them a part of the team and keep them a part of the fold and their family, whatever their needs look like, that they may not even realize in that initial response. That will create effects throughout the rest of their life, throughout the rest of their careers, for their ability to trust in our system, to trust in their leaders, to trust in their peers. And so that's just the individual's experience. But even if you just take one layer out, in their immediate family, their immediate work center, their peers who are passing judgment one way or the other on what they believe, what they don't believe, what they're allowed to talk about, what they're not, how to support that victim, and then still somehow be able to accomplish the mission and deal with all of the other challenges and struggles that come up with military service that aren't easy in their own right. But when you add something as complex as a sexual trauma, or an environment that's pervasive with sexual harassment, where there already now is not inherently any trust in the team around you, How on earth could you expect somebody to be ready for the hardest mission that they might ever walk into? How are we going to be ready to go toe to toe against an adversary? How are we going to be ready as a military if we can't even within our own ranks establish that trust and that responsiveness that we need to have?
Thank you for offering that, Jess. Now, Lauren, you were open enough to share in your introduction that you were a survivor.
Mhm.
Can you possibly shed some light and go into as much detail as you feel comfortable going into on the
So my story was actually at home. I was with this person. This person was my partner, and we had did deployments back to back, so we hadn't seen each other. They had overlapped, so we went about 10 months without seeing each other. I had found out that there was infidelity going on, and then I told him that I didn't want to be with him, and we ended up going to premarital counseling prior to getting married. And then once we had gotten married, that's when everything had started. And it was as simple as forcing me to kiss him initially. And then it went on to more of the, like Chief said, more of the complex, very gruesome, forcible things. And when I came forward about it to my first sergeant at the time, he said, well, you're married now. So that, you're on the boat now. You gotta learn how to swim, is what he said. And I was like, wow, I didn't think your job was to be judge and jury. I thought you were here to help me. And so I just kept it bottled in, and I didn't talk to anybody. I didn't talk to my flight chief, didn't talk to my supervisor. I came to work armed up. They said ready to post. We said raw, and I did my 8-hour shift and went home. And I lived like that for about 8 months.
I'm sorry to hear that. What ultimately gave you the confidence or enabled you to come forward with your experience, to share your story and kind of bring it out from bottled within?
So when I was so after I had left my first station, I soon got divorced. He ended up staying behind. We did not file for joint spouse. And I went to ALS, and we went through a lot of curriculum about how to supervise troops who go through sexual assault, sexual harassment, what they're afforded, what we can do as a supervisor, what we cannot do, situations like that. And I said, that broadened my view of, hey, this is how this was supposed to be. Why did I get treated the way I was? And then about 3 months later, I was actually on TDY and doing a presidential sweep, and I get a call from my troop back at my home station, and she said that her spouse had sexually assaulted her. And I said, okay. And I said, well, what do you want to do? What are your options? What do you want to do? And she told me what she wanted to do, and I made a phone call, and that person came and picked her up, and we started that process. After about 3 months dealing with her situation, along with her, she was having a lot of trouble trusting the people around her, trusting not me, but like my supervisors, her chain of command, because she felt like now everybody was looking at her different because her husband was a cop and he outranked her. And that was the same situation that I was going through. And I felt like I was looking into the mirror, and I didn't deal with my stuff because I was never afforded those rights. I never sat down with someone. I never went to mental health. I never went to medical. I never got a rape kit. I was never given any of those options. It was, you're on the boat. If it sinks, learn how to swim. And I ended up sitting down with her, and I talked to her about it. And she said, well, Senior McClifton, why don't you go to mental health with me? And I was hurt. I felt like she was calling me out, like, you're not supposed to supervise me. I'm supposed to supervise you. And at the time I was dating someone, and he knew about what was going on. And he was like, I know you don't want to hear this, but maybe she's correct. Maybe she's right. And then that's started my mental health journey. that a situation that was parallel with mine is what made me face my situation and be okay with talking to people and letting them know this is the incorrect way. Yes, I was, a test rabbit in this equation, but let's not do it this way anymore. Let's change it. Let's change the way that we handle those things, because if I was, if I wasn't as strong as I was, or I wasn't as goal oriented I was, I don't know what I would have done.
No, thank you. Really, thank you for sharing that with us. So can you possibly speak to the impact that actually utilizing some of these mental health services has had on your road to full recovery?
So I used everything from mental health counselor at medical. We had a what they call it. It's kind of like what we have here on flight with Miss Sherry, where we'll
Maybe an
have
MFLAG?
a rep. Yeah, kind of like MFLAG too. I did use MFLAG when I was in Korea, but when I was in Arizona, I used a flight rep we had, and I spoke with her twice a month. After work, she would come in at 5 a.m, and we would go get coffee, or we'd go get breakfast at the DFAC, and we'd just talk. She talked with me for an hour. It could have been about, the past trauma, or what was weighing heavy on me now. And sometimes she would help me make the connection between the two. A lot of times we as adults, when we go through things, especially very emotional and degrading things that make you feel less than what you are as women, because we are more emotional than men, we tend to skip over the smaller things because we don't think that they have an impact. And when you're able to talk with someone who's unbiased and is actively listening in that area, they help out a lot more than you think you do.
So Sherry, to those who may be in a similar situation insofar that they may not feel comfortable coming forward, or maybe there are those who have gone through a traumatic experience such as sexual harassment or assault. They're going through trauma and they don't even realize it.
Mhm.
From a mental health perspective, to those who conscientiously make a choice to forego accessing mental health care, can you speak to the short and long-term impacts that survivors can experience if they choose to not access those resources, as Lauren ended up choosing to do so?
Yeah, definitely. So short term, um, so what happens is like, our brains are constantly trying to process stuff, and trauma affects people in very different ways, but then in also very similar ways. And one of the most common normal things that a trauma response is to ignore it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it because that was scary, uncomfortable, whatever. I don't like the way I feel when I think about it. So I don't want to go talk about it. So avoidance, avoidance, avoidance. So immediately, we can start really trying to avoid those memories, avoid those thoughts, avoid those conversations, avoid places. And what is happening in the brain then is we're not processing. And so that event and all of the things surrounding that event, it could be um, a song. Maybe there was a song playing in the background that you weren't consciously aware of, but all of a sudden you're in the store and 6 months later and you're having a full-blown panic attack and you don't know why. Well, it's because that song was playing in their overhead system, and even if you weren't really paying attention to it, your brain hears it and your brain remembers that connection. It could be any number of things. So not seeking help because we're embarrassed, we're scared, we don't trust, certainly has some significant short-term impacts, but the longer that goes without being addressed, then it's like those fear responses and all of those things in the brain get kind of solidified. So it gets it gets kind of stuck. That event then becomes like a long-term kind of trauma response, if that makes sense. So yeah, so definitely not addressing it can end up causing way more significant problems long term than we realize. So
Well, thank you for that, Sherry. And
yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Lauren, when you were sharing your story, you had said that it started off as something that seems small, and then it escalated into something that was way beyond that.
Correct.
I know Jess had mentioned in her opening remarks the Independent Review Commission's 90-day review on sexual assault in the military. And so a key component of that Independent Review Commission's review was an emphasis on the necessity to establish a continuum of harm for harassment and assault. And so, Jess, I was wondering if you could possibly share why it's so critical for harassment and assault to be treated in a more synonymous manner than perhaps it is currently being treated in.
I appreciate that question, the subject. When harassment is permitted and it's unchecked, it creates this undertone, and there's an undertone from disrespect to abuse of authority to leadership through fear and intimidation and control to sexual deviancy. It is on that spectrum of the continuum of harm, and it's on the spectrum that creates this environment where unacceptable behaviors prevail, and it creates this space for more extreme misconduct, right, for progression of that behavior, and it creates an environment where we will believe that everyone knows that it's happening and everyone's accepting it happening because these other behaviors further to the left on that scale, on that sliding scale, and that continuum of harm are happening and are pervasive throughout the culture. And so some of that is within subcultures, but some of that is pervasive across the military. And the report, does start disclosing and uncovering and kind of breaking the silence with some of that.
And Lauren, to those who may be out there, who may be on the receiving end of behaviors that are in any way similar to the behaviors in those preliminary and beginning stages that you were on the receiving end of, what would you say to them now, looking back at your experience? What advice or insight would you give to them on how they can navigate the experiences that they're going through today?
Whether it's, like Chief said, once we allow it, that creates the baseline. That's the tempo we're going at. Whether you're getting to your first duty station and that's the way that things are, if it doesn't feel right, I would speak up on it, because regardless if you say something or not, you're going to get a negative bounce back. You're either going to get looks, sound, somebody's going to say something back to you that you don't like, but you know that it's incorrect and it's not morally correct. But you're also setting the tone. You without saying anything are validating that behavior, that environment. And if that's the environment that you say you don't want to be in, but you're allowing it to stay that way, then you're just becoming a part of the problem. And it sucks to say it that way, but it's 100% true. I personally, I would speak to the most personable person that you whether that's in your chain of command or outside. Ask them, do you notice this? Is this a thing that is allowed all the time, or is this just something that happens in a subculture? I think as cops, we deal with that a lot. You know, you have your 6 flights, 4 flights, if you're working 12s, and each flight is different. It's like its own little town. And then you do a flights walk and you go to the next flight and you're like, whoa, what is this? You know, it's a culture change. If you don't like it, you got to say something. But you can't not say something either.
And Sherry, from a mental health perspective, can you possibly provide the viewers some insight into how early intervention with a mental health professional could potentially empower or enable individuals to speak up and to do more in setting the tone for saying that this behavior is not okay?
Yes, absolutely. So I really am glad that you said that, Lauren, because whenever you were saying, you're going to get kind of some negative response either way, whether you say something or not. But by not saying anything, it kind of continues to perpetuate. And so this is one of the things that I did want to say, and it goes along with why seeking that help so early is so vital to not only that person's recovery, but then also to empowering them to be able to be more bold about speaking up. So probably the most common reaction for someone who's been, either sexually harassed or assaulted, is a sense of guilt, a sense of shame, a sense of embarrassment, fear that nobody's going to believe them, questioning themselves, because usually their perpetrator can be very good at causing them to question their own sanity and, whether or not they were a willing participant. Just there's so much psychological damage that sexual assault and harassment does. So addressing all of those really negative, just horrible feelings that go along with that are so normal, the earlier that you can get some help in coping with that and kind of coming to terms with some of those things, the better off, the sooner you're going to be able to process not just what happened, but all of the stuff that is associated with it, all of the ways that it has caused you to question yourself and to, just all of those really uncomfortable feelings that nobody wants to feel. So the sooner that we can start really working through those, obviously the better, So, and in doing that, through a kind of like what Lauren said earlier, having somebody who's non-biased, who's neutral, who can help you make those connections between the small things, this trauma and then this little small thing, is extremely important. And that's just all part of empowering that person to be able to say, like, look, I am a survivor and this is what's happening. And I see that this is still happening and it's not okay. So many times we don't say anything because people are either going to not believe us or, say nasty things about us or, just whatever. So it's being able to help work through that and work up, I guess, build up the courage and the strength to be able to say, no, this is not okay. Gosh, I've had clients before who were victims of sexual harassment, like severe sexual harassment. And it actually never even got to the phase of being physical, but they still developed PTSD. They still, it affected them so severely, panic attacks, like, I mean, just her life was, um, it really took a toll on her family, um, so working with her through that and all of those negative, gosh, it can just affect your self-esteem, your self-worth, everything. So being able to work through that, and get to a place of, this happened to me, it was not my fault, um, and become empowered just makes so much difference, so much difference. And it's important to do that with a professional who is, trained in trauma, because trauma has a very significant effect on the brain. And so being able to work with somebody who's educated and trained in those things specifically, who can be neutral, um, who isn't going to repeat what you say. So there's that reassurance too, that everything you say, is confidential, um, is great. We always need support of our family and friends, but they're not going to be able to be neutral, and they're also not trained in this specifically. So really, honestly, having that mental health help plus your social and familial support that's the recipe right there for being able to really truly cope with what has happened.
I think what this conversation really underscores and potentially highlights is that as egregious as the numbers currently are, it's very possible that because there are those who don't feel comfortable coming forward, that the numbers that are already out there are severely underreported.
Absolutely.
In recent years, it's been estimated that as many as over 75% of survivors, did not go through the process of reporting a special victims crime. And chances are, if they didn't do that, then they also simultaneously didn't go through the process of accessing the care that they need. And so, Sherry, from a mental health perspective, for those who genuinely have strong convictions that mental health will not help, mental health care will not help them, are there any self-care methods that you believe could actually reduce trauma and actually put individuals in a better position to recover without those professional services?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that I'll say is quite often somebody has had a bad experience, unfortunately, with mental health, or they know somebody who's had a bad experience. And so what I say to those people is like, look, I realize the military kind of owns you and they might make it a little bit more difficult, but you always have a choice. Just because you had one bad experience, or maybe even two, doesn't mean that like every therapist out there is bad. So find somebody, advocate for yourself. But as far as self-care type things to do, key is don't avoid talking about it. Don't avoid facing it. Talk to somebody that that you trust. Maybe if they're not comfortable with going to mental health, they can go see a chaplain, if they have a pastor, if they have somebody who's going to be able to, give them some support and listen. The key is don't shy away. Don't try to just sweep it under the rug and act like it didn't happen, because it did happen. And talking about it, acknowledging it, isn't going to make it happen anymore. But ignoring it and all of that certainly isn't going to make it happen any less. So what happened happened. And I cannot stress how important it is to talk about it, to journal, to get it out. Remember that, like I said, our brains are constantly trying to process. That's why we dream, and so just acknowledging that, and letting your brain kind of do what it needs to do, which is, talk about it, talk about how you feel, talk about what your thoughts are, journal, just being very gentle with yourself. Really, you know, I tell people all the time, like, what is your self-talk? And if you have somebody who you care about and they're experiencing this, they're a victim, what would you say to them? You know, would you say things to them that, like, yeah, it's probably your fault, you should feel guilty? And everybody is always like, no, I wouldn't do that. Okay, then talk to yourself the same way. Don't talk to if you wouldn't talk to this person you care for that way, don't talk to yourself that way. So it's crucial to pay attention to that self-talk, to not feed those feelings of blame, understanding that there are very normal, very common reactions to trauma and especially sexual assaults. Just because they're normal doesn't mean that those are the feelings you want camping out in there forever, you know. So it's common and it's normal to feel guilty, but that doesn't mean that you are guilty. It doesn't mean that you're responsible. The person who's responsible is the person who did it. So acknowledging those feelings that you're having, and just like I said, being very gentle with yourself and not avoiding. Those are key, absolute key.
Thank you for that. And Jess, so in taking a step back from that mental health side, perhaps whether it be from the perspective of a leader or perhaps as a teammate, what steps do you believe can be taken to better support those that you're surrounded by during this time of need? And perhaps that could manifest in them going through those proper channels to either report if that's what they choose to do so, or access mental health. What steps do you believe can be taken?
I think it starts with the narrative that exists within that organization or that team, right? Because if the narrative is not one that increases the belief in the protection of victims' rights and the process and trusting the victim and caring for the member, right, and still and reminding them that they matter and acknowledging that we do make mistakes in the process, right, and there are people who may think that they're doing right by somebody and they mishandle something, because it happens and there's evidence of it, right? There's some striking stories that are represented of cases being mishandled, and I think we need to break the silence on some of those things, but also take a step back and listen to the narrative that exists in our organizations. Are we educating our own force? How are we talking about victims? How are we talking to victims? How are we talking about the alleged offenders? You know, what are we doing day to day, and what is the conversation and what is the tone that exists in the unit? Because that's gonna tell us, right? Because more options and more reporting options, although yes, we need to address that, more options don't inherently equal more trust. And more reporting doesn't inherently equal more prevention. We have to increase the belief in the protection, and we have to care for the human, and we have to at times not just trust the process, but at times we have to speed the process and the care to the person because we know that's what they need. And some of that I think Sherry spoke to you very eloquently. There is kind of a critical gap in the period of time, right? There's a critical window where we've got to be able to the sooner we can get to that victim and get them some care, the better chance that some of those traumatization effects won't solidify as much, right? But that's I think the first step is listen to the narrative and acknowledge the narrative and break the silence on it and actually talk about it, because then we can start educating on the actual process and the rights that victims have. Airman Leadership School shouldn't be the first time that somebody learns about it. You know, when they get an annual training on restricted versus unrestricted reporting, we have an opportunity to actually go much further, and we're starting to actually talk about consent and how does that apply and what does that look like in your real life situations and scenarios for a predominantly very young force that serves. And so when we can increase education on the actual life circumstances, but also the process that happens once somebody reports and the rights that are afforded to them, we can increase some understanding of trauma and how it affects members, so that those first responders that first encounter a trauma victim, because the way that they interact and the way that they handle that scenario is going to have deep and profound impact on the victim, and even on their family and their ability to trust the process. When we break the silence on what is actual harassment and what is abuse of authority and what is controlling behavior that is on that continuum of harm, and while it may not necessarily be sexual in nature, there still are behaviors that aggregate into an environment where somebody believes that they don't matter, or that the conduct that's happening is acceptable around them. And so really the two things I think that underpin affecting some positive change is listening to our own narrative and understanding what it is, so that we can be deliberate in breaking through that. If we just continue forward with what we have been doing for the past decade, it's not going to change. We're going to be chasing after it, and we need to get left of bang. But in order to do that, we have to understand what is the actual culture that we're in within our respective organizations, and then within the military as a whole.
And Lauren, the same question for you. You know, what steps do you believe can be taken to foster an environment, to truly foster an environment of zero tolerance and better support those who may be suffering from invisible wounds?
So I think,
PTSD.
sorry, I think like I have to agree with Ms. Sherry, like Chief said, when a victim goes through these things, one, it is very overwhelming when you start looking at what you're afforded, your options versus restricted versus unrestricted, going to a chaplain, going to medical, and then that's not even touching the physical side of like a rape kit and the pictures and the questions, and then going to meet with, you know, your attorney and everything. I think if you can have a good team, a good leadership in your unit, and if every unit could have an MFLAC, or like we have with Ms. Sherry, you can just go talk. Sometimes I didn't even want to tell people what happened to me. And I know a lot of people, there are a lot of women and men that felt the same way that I did. I didn't want to talk about what happened to me, but I would let out my emotions and my guilt that I shouldn't have had of being a horrible wife, because why did that happen to me, you know, through other conversations, because I didn't trust my leadership, because my leadership were the ones that did not give me what I was supposed to have. But if we can have a good I say way of life in the unit where you can trust, like, hey, I can go to this person. I can tell this person what happened to me, and I know that they're not going to say anything, or I want to go talk to an MFLAC, or I want to go talk to mental health. And I should be able to tell my supervisor, hey, this is what I'm going to go do, and not have to worry about being de-armed the next day, or worry about people talking about me the next day about why I'm going to do it. You know, I know if something were to happen to me right now, I could call chief, or I could call my commander, or call my first sergeant, or I can call my supervisor and say, hey, this is what's going on with me. I need help. And I know that I won't show up the next day to work and there will be rumors, but not every unit has that. I know the leadership before we had in this squadron, we didn't have that with them. And the airmen and the NCOs really like the leadership we have now, because we know that there is a sense of confidentiality when it comes to talking about sensitive subjects that are going on in our unit.
You know, I think something that you had mentioned is actually an important topic of conversation to have when we kind of look at this, right, on this continuum of harm. And it's not only about the actions that may negatively impact, but it's also a matter of this impacting men and women alike. And so, Jess, I was wondering if you could possibly provide the viewers with a perspective when men are left out of the conversation and perhaps are not treated as survivors in the same light as females who may be going through the same exact thing. What impact do you believe this has on the overall deterrence effort that's out there, and how can we kind of reframe this conversation and better support one another?
So Ed, I think it's very straightforward. When we don't acknowledge that men are victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault, we are saying we don't believe it's happening. Right? If it's not part of the dialogue and we don't break that silence, you're inferring that it's not existing because we're not even talking about it. And I would say we're starting to talk about it, right? But when you leave it out of the conversation, just because the data tells us the predominance of victims are women, that doesn't mean that men aren't victims, and we have to acknowledge it and we have to talk about it. But I would go even further to say that with women, it's very different when we talk about when we just sort of take a step back and look at how we respond. And it doesn't mean every organization and every incident, but for the most part, when we're dealing with a woman that's a victim, when it's sexual harassment and on that end of the continuum of harm, on that end of the spectrum, we are almost quicker to handle it. Right? Those are stomped out when sexual harassment is happening. But then when we get to that side of the spectrum of sexual assault and rape, we start asking, well, was it consensual? Well, are we sure that it wasn't? And let's really examine that. And so we kind of flip it. But with men, there's greater attention in the opposite manner, if you will, right? So sexual harassment of men, we don't even acknowledge it. It happens, and it happens in the same mechanism of power and control, maybe less grooming behaviors, right? But still power and control, which is what sexual harassment and sexual assault are most often about, not actual sexual gratification. But that's not even part of the conversation with men. We almost expect that within predominantly male environments. And we just allow it to happen. And so, it's so critical to what you brought up earlier, that harassment and assault have to be considered, not synonymous that they are as severe as one another, but they are on that same continuum of harm. And then when you look at men, when it reaches that point of sexual assault or rape, we don't start at, was it consensual, right? But for women, the question is different, and the line of questioning is different, and the line of conversation and the narrative is different. And so I think culturally, we have created these ideas behind the genders, and we're starting to break out of those, right? As we see movements within our society, that's happening within our military as well, and moving away from some of the gender stereotypes that happen. But there are different responses based on gender within the sexual harassment and sexual assault realm, hands down. And so I think, again, I would go back to, we have to acknowledge it, because if we're not aware of it, it's happening, and it's happening silently, and it's impacting our decisions, and it's impacting the way that we talk to people. It's influencing, the bias is influencing, how we handle somebody that does come forward. And so in so doing, every time we mishandle that, we break that trust of that person. And we break the trust of anybody, right, that ripples out to, that's affected by that. And so we show them, this is how we handle it, or mishandle it, shall I say. And so then in so doing, we're moving even further backwards in this environment of education and prevention and willingness to act when something is unacceptable. And so then we're moving away from zero tolerance if we allow that to stay as the pervasive nature of the conversation, particularly when it comes to men as victims.
And I think it could also be said that these deeply seated cultural norms, if that's what we want to call them, that ultimately have that impact on the nature of the conversation, can also trickle down to something as large or small as the stigma that could potentially impact a male's decision or a female's decision to actually seek the mental health care that they need. And so, Sherry, I was wondering if you could possibly kind of just talk about if the delivery of mental health services differ between men and women. And then also prior to that, are there different behaviors that you see between men and women whether or not they choose to actually seek that care?
So I think that, whenever I was kind of looking up the stats, when you consider how unreported sexual assault still is, and you see the numbers, and then you know, it's just it quite frankly, it's like overwhelming. But whenever you consider the fact that, like, statistically, 1 in 6 men are sexually assaulted, and that's who reports. So it's, you know, I think they experience very strong feelings, just like women do, of, you know, shame, guilt, embarrassment, all of that. But depending on if they were assaulted by a woman or another man, can cause some very strong emotional reactions. So, for instance, if if a heterosexual man is sexually assaulted by another man, then his own fear of stigma of being, you know, called homosexual or whatever could very much, and very much does, prevent them from saying anything. That could roll over into seeking medical help as well, you know, because they could suffer. We know that sexual assault can cause some very significant physical damage. Treatment wise, or let me back up. So there can be huge amount of embarrassment for a male, regardless if he's assaulted by another male or a woman. But if they're assaulted by a woman, then there's the shame of feeling like, you know, I should have been physically strong enough to keep that from happening. Or, you know, again, the embarrassment of what are people going to say, because there's still such an overwhelming misguided belief that men cannot be sexually assaulted. Because for one thing, things happen to our bodies physiologically, you know, and sometimes our bodies react, even if, you know, it's distressing, and we don't like it and we don't want it to happen. Physiologically, there can be some reactions. And so, especially for men, that can be extremely confusing. That can also happen for women as well. I heard one woman one time say, you know, that her body responded physiologically, and for her, that was the ultimate betrayal. So she was assaulted by this person who she knew and had trusted, but then her body responding physiologically to that was even, for
It's
her,
damaging. It's
extremely damaging. Yeah.
100% damaging.
Yeah. And because so there's just adds to the confusion and adds to the, you know, questioning of yourself and all of that. So I think the treatment for sexual assault victims looks very similar, um, with the understanding that there may be some, you know, like for men, some of those very normal reactions might be more pronounced, I guess, you know, maybe is the word that I'm looking for, in men than maybe the women. And for women, you know, they may experience a lot more feelings of, like, you know, anger, especially if they're assaulted by a male. So I think there's just very normal common reactions all the way around, but some may be really amplified in males, or in some may be more amplified in women. So and it also has to, you know, another thing that really affects that is, you know, is it a partner? You know, there, I mean, my goodness, I remember, and I'm not that old. I tell people all the time, I am not that old. But I remember it wasn't all that, like, just within my lifetime, that it wasn't even considered rape if it was your your spouse. Yeah, absolutely. So fortunately we are getting smarter, but we still have culturally, man, we still have so many misperceptions and misguidance and stuff that we honestly, I think is what keeps us from moving as far forward as we need to be by now. So, um, but anyway, I know I kind of veered off the question there a little bit, Matt. I apologize for that, but I think yes, that the treatment looks very, very similar. Um, but um, depending on, there can just be very I don't want to say necessarily unique, but kind of very specific feelings and struggles that that person, especially a male, may be experiencing that looks a little bit different than whenever a female is a victim.
And going off of that, but slightly in a different direction, I also think that for those who personally haven't gone through something as traumatic as that, and from the outsider's perspective looking in, they often focus on the action itself. But in reality, that action itself could trigger different emotional responses. And so, this whole conception of what is and isn't consent is truly defined from what those emotional responses to those physical acts are. And I think that a way in which we could really bridge the gap between those two things is to have that level of understanding that there are emotional responses that occur following pursuant to these actions, whether or not those actions are viewed in the same light as assault, harassment, rape, etc. It's also important to understand that there are those emotions and feelings that are either occurring during the incident or after the incident as well. I also think that all of this that we've talked about tonight can compound ultimately in any service member's decision to stay in the force. Perhaps the trauma might be too much to bear. Perhaps there are those out there who don't feel as if they've received the support that they needed. And this is something that the IRC review had actually gone into a little bit more detailed about, and specifically stated that there were those who wanted to continue their service. They loved to serve their country. They wanted to do everything they possibly could to stay in, but they were unable to because they felt as if they had to navigate that in an individual manner. But ultimately, for those like Lauren, they show that that's not the case for everyone. And so, Lauren, I was possibly wondering if you could possibly share, ultimately what prompted you to stay in the force. Did you ever have any doubts in your mind about whether you wanted to stay, or was this a no? Can you possibly talk a little bit about that?
100%. So after I tried to report my assault, I was still stuck overseas with my spouse at the time for roughly 6 to 8 more months. And every day I was thinking about how can I get out without getting dishonorably discharged? Like, can I report something to medical to get me med boarded? Can I, like, what possibly could I do without harming myself, but without making a dumb decision like going to get a DUI or overseas? But what kept me going was I was pursuing canine at the time, and my spouse, my ex-husband at the time, he understood that that was something that I really wanted to do. And amongst all the things that he was putting me through at home, he never touched my hopes and dreams for canine. So on days I would work a shift, and after shift I'd take an hour and a half nap in my car, and then I would drive 2 hours to the nearest base that had canine there, and I'd spend the whole day there, and I'd take a nap and then drive home. And by the time I got home, he was at work. So I had an escape that still kept fire burning inside of me. So when I PCS'd and I finally got canine and I finally got divorced, It felt like I had, that feeling when you graduate BMT and you get your coin and your family's there and everything. Like, that's what I felt. I was like, I'm going to canine school. I'm going to get there. We're going to hit the ground running, and my life is going to start back again. I'm going to start feeling like a normal human being. And that was just my goal for myself, because I knew, even now, but then I knew I wasn't done with the Air Force, and the Air Force wasn't done with me. And I never really lost that mindset. I'm not sure why, maybe my faith in my religion, but not once did I ever feel that getting out would solve all of my issues. Maybe that temporary issue at the time, but not the big one.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Lauren. Really appreciate it. Well, guys, for the last hour or so, we've had an unbelievable conversation about ways in which we could better foster a zero tolerance climate. We've shed some really in-depth conversations on the ways in which we could provide better services and discuss the overall, nature of the services that are provided today. And we've even had, people like Lauren brave enough to share their stories with us as well. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be a part of this panel. And before we conclude, I just want to go around the horn and see if anyone has any closing remarks they want to give in reference to ways in which, we can better, foster a zero tolerance climate, or ways in which we can improve the current state of affairs that perhaps we haven't discussed already. And so if anyone wants to speak up on that, please feel free.
I'll jump in. We hit on a lot of things. Lauren hit on establishing boundaries individually. I would add to that we have to establish boundaries collectively. There has to be a clearly understood environment of zero tolerance. I believe that we can better do that by holding commanders accountable to behavior within their organization that's along the continuum of harm. And so I do think that's one of the efforts that the IRC has pointed out, and I stand by that. I believe in that, that the zero tolerance comes from the commander, and from working in an organization comparatively where anything on that continuum, sexual assault, anything that we say is zero tolerance, that went to the commander's level for action and for corrective action, I've watched that reverberate across the organization and reset boundaries for the organization, right? And so I would offer that. I would offer access to victim advocates has to increase on and off duty, and just almost, if you will, normalizing what that looks like, and normalizing what mental health care can be. And it doesn't have to fit into this exact scenario, and that can be proactive efforts, and that can be preventative efforts, and that can be education on what a healthy environment really is. What is dominant behavior? What is bullying behavior? What are grooming behaviors? What is harassing? So that we can root those things out. And then we can educate on trauma responses. We can educate on processes, not just this is the type of reporting and this is who's obligated. We could start getting to that deeper layer of it. And then very specifically, because all three of our panel members are attached to or within a security forces organization, I will tell you, we have an entire population, actually, our largest enlisted population on the Air Force side, that doesn't have the ability to have victim advocates within their organization because of Department of Defense instruction, but further Air Force instruction prevents not just law enforcement officers, but anybody associated assigned to a security forces squadron cannot be a victim advocate, even if they're not police. And so we are making it even harder on victims to have access to care. Our minds already tell us that this is just your individual problem and you're alone, when you're not. Right? So start with that. You're not alone. We do believe you, even if we have failed in our initial response, right? Even if we have missed warning signs, even if we haven't been there to stop it, you're not alone. And we want to find you that mix of support. If you want to continue to serve, we want to get you to be able to continue to serve, right? And we have some options within our system to do that, but we're missing the mark if we don't have the ability to have advocates and confidentiality within our own community. And so I would say those are the key areas that at every opportunity that I can influence, I want to continue to try to do that. And thank you for this forum and this opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I want to jump in and kind of piggyback off what you said, Chief, because that is, man alive. Like, I was rooting while you were saying all of that. We have to do a little bit better, you know. It's so difficult, you know. This is a big squadron, fairly tight. You know, they're working together. They form friendships, and then if one of them is a victim, most likely their good friend, the person that they're going to go to, is another security forces member. And so it puts, they can't even, you know, I can't imagine if something extremely upsetting happened to me, not being able to go to my best friend, not being able to say, oh my gosh, you know, and like go to her as a friend, because she's like, don't tell me that because I'm a mandated reporter, you know. So we've got to do better. The Air Force has got to do better, you know. Yeah. So, and I think that we need to do a better job, and I think we are doing a better job of really talking about what is consent, what does consent look like, what does it not look like. And we also really need to start being better with teaching empowerment, teaching boldness, you know, preparing people to speak up, because that's how we stop it. Whenever those little early things happen, you know, when things are said, a lot of times people will just, you know, they don't want to speak up. They don't want to say, hey, that's not cool, because they're either called you know, a not nice word, or they're blown off, or, you know, just whatever. I think that's another area that we need to really be focusing on, is helping people get bolder, you know, and not only talking about like, hey, this isn't cool, but why isn't it cool? You know, why does this fit in that realm of our zero tolerance? You know, not just what are we not going to tolerate, but why? Because that's a huge chunk that's missing, that people don't understand. And so I think that too is an area that has to be part of the focus in order to really start making as big a difference as we need to make, you know, for not just prevention, but or not just postvention, I'll say, but prevention.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, I agree. I think the general conclusion here amongst all of us is the mandatory reporting is killing the security forces community. I know plenty of people who had wished that they could tell their best friend or their coworker, you know, but you can't. And even if we take the personal relationship out of it, when a sexual assault is called in to the law enforcement desk, we are sent out 9 times out of 10. We are sent out initially until we can get a SAPR, SHARP, some kind of sexual assault representative out there. I personally would not want to talk with anybody else other than someone who is trained to respond to these types of things. And I think you take away a huge benefit and a huge resource when you take away cops being able to have that that resource. You know, I've responded to sexual assaults before, and myself and another female patrolman were on scene. And you talk to this person, and you're telling them, you know, hey, you're asking them, have you done this yet? Have you taken a shower? Where did it happen? You know, we need to know these things. And then you add in a whole nother factor. And that person comes in and they ask the same exact thing over. And then they take them to a building, and then they meet with another person, and that person asks them the same 20 questions over again. And it's just, this is what I meant earlier about patience. And it's overwhelming, because it is you are adding so many factors inside one situation when you're looking at an authority position versus, hey, maybe we can take some cops out of the career field and actually make them representatives and make them train them up to be what they need. They can still hold a cop role, but this is what they're going to be doing for a while. We trust them enough to respond to these on duty, and that's all they're doing. You know, because when not every base has true north, you know, and then you go to overseas locations and there's too many NATO bases to be able to afford that resource as well. And I think we need to do better. We do. With men, with women, with subordinates, with leaders. I think everyone, no one is untouchable with this subject, and that's the baseline of it.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to take this opportunity once again to just to say thank you to each and every one of you for taking the time to spotlight a lot of these issues that we're talking about. If you, the viewer, are interested in learning more about many of the recommendations that have been spotlighted today, I highly encourage you, please visit the HQ AFSA website under the Law 2021 tab and scroll down to day 7. You will get to learn a little bit more about AFSA's position on this matter, and also get to engage with some of the resources that have been referenced throughout the course of the past hour 15 minutes or so. And so thank you so much, everyone, once again, for taking the time. To the viewers, thank you for watching and staying tuned with us for the past hour or so. This panel does conclude the 2021 Legislative Awareness Week Policy Panel Series. And this is the final day of the 2021 law. But please do not be mistaken. Our advocacy efforts on this front don't end at day 7 of the 2021 law. They also didn't begin with the preparations of the law. They will continue after, and they existed before. Because what AFSA does is advocate for improved quality of life service members, past and present, and their families. And so I want to thank everyone for taking the time. To the viewers at home, thank you for watching, and get the word out about the 2021 Legislative Awareness Week and how leaders, how survivors, and how everyone in between can better foster a zero tolerance climate throughout our nation and world. So thank you very much, everyone. And
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you.